The war was over, but the roar refused to die. When the final surrender papers were signed and the radios stopped crackling with urgent commands, the airfields of America and Europe were still crowded with thousands of P-51 Mustangs, their long noses pointed toward empty skies as if waiting for an enemy that would never return. Only weeks earlier, these machines had been the sharp edge of victory, slicing through clouds at 30,000 feet, escorting bombers into the heart of enemy territory, and turning desperate dogfights into one-sided slaughters. Now silence pressed down on them, heavy and unfamiliar. Mechanics walked more slowly. Pilots lingered beside cockpits, touching aluminum skin as if saying goodbye to a trusted friend. No one knew what came next, least of all the Mustang itself. During the war, the P-51 had been everything the Allies needed it to be. It was fast, deadly, and capable of flying farther than any fighter before it. A guardian angel for bomber crews who once believed deep missions were suicide. Its Rolls-Royce Merlin engine sang a lethal song that German pilots learned to fear, and its presence changed the balance of power in the air. Factories had churned them out by the tens of thousands, feeding an endless hunger for air superiority. Victory came, however, and that hunger vanished overnight. The world no longer demanded fighters in such numbers, and the Mustang, for all its fame, suddenly faced the same fate as countless other wartime tools: obsolescence. Across the United States, vast storage fields filled with silver aircraft parked, wingtip to wingtip, stretching to the horizon like metallic graveyards. Mustangs were flown to desert bases in California, Arizona, and Texas, where the dry air preserved them, while officials debated their future. Some were barely worn, having arrived too late to see combat. Others bore scars from flak and bullets, patched hastily in wartime and never repaired properly. Pilots who had trusted the aircraft with their lives now watched them fade into rows of inactivity, their engines wrapped and sealed, their tires slowly sinking into dust. The question lingered in every briefing room and budget meeting: were these machines still useful, or were they expensive reminders of a war everyone wanted to forget? The rapid advance of technology made the answer seem obvious to many. Jet engines, once experimental curiosities, had proven themselves in the final months of the conflict. Germany's Me-262 had terrified Allied pilots with its speed, and American engineers were already pushing forward with designs that promised to leave propellers behind forever. In this new jet age, the Mustang looked suddenly old-fashioned. It was magnificent, yes, but built for a world that was already slipping into history. Military planners began to imagine air forces dominated by sleek jets streaking across the sky, while piston-engine fighters were quietly pushed aside. Yet the Mustang was not ready to surrender its relevance so easily. Beneath its elegant lines lay a rugged, adaptable machine that had always thrived on being underestimated. Even as jets captured headlines, officers recognized that the P-51 still had strengths no new aircraft could immediately replace. It was cheaper to operate, easier to maintain, and familiar to thousands of pilots already trained to fly it. In a world exhausted by war and weary of new conflicts, those practical advantages mattered more than raw speed. For a brief moment, the Mustang existed in a strange limbo, too valuable to discard, yet too old to represent the future. Demobilization transformed the lives of the men who had flown the Mustang, just as dramatically as it transformed the aircraft itself. Young pilots who had been kings of the sky returned home to civilian jobs, carrying memories that refused to fade. Some tried to forget the sound of gunfire and the sight of falling aircraft. Others clung to those memories, attending reunions and swapping stories about close calls and lost friends. For them, the Mustang was more than metal and rivets. It was a symbol of survival, of youth spent in a brutal crucible. Seeing rows of Mustangs mothballed in the desert felt like watching a part of themselves being stored away. Meanwhile, governments around the world watched America's surplus with keen interest. Many nations emerged from the war with air forces in ruins, their budgets shattered, their infrastructure damaged. The P-51 offered a tempting solution, a proven, powerful fighter available in large numbers at relatively low cost. Deals were struck, papers signed, and Mustangs began new journeys across oceans, packed onto ships or flown under new insignia. For these aircraft, the end of World War II was not an ending at all, but a turning point. Before those transfers fully reshaped its destiny, the Mustang endured a quieter phase, one defined by uncertainty rather than glory. Engineers tested modifications, exploring whether the aircraft could be adapted for new roles in a changing world. Could it serve as a trainer, teaching the next generation of pilots the fundamentals of high-performance flight? Could it be modified for reconnaissance, carrying cameras instead of guns? These questions were debated in offices far from the roar of engines, but their answers would determine whether the Mustang lived on or faded into memory. Public perception of the aircraft also shifted in these early post-war years. During the conflict, newsreels and newspapers had celebrated the P-51 as a heroic defender of freedom, its image intertwined with victory itself. Afterward, attention moved on quickly. The world wanted peace, prosperity, and new wonders, not reminders of destruction. Jets, with their futuristic profiles and promises of unimaginable speed, captured imaginations instead. The Mustang became yesterday's hero, respected but no longer adored by the masses. Still, something stubborn clung to its reputation. Pilots spoke of the Mustang with a reverence rarely granted to machines. They remembered how it handled at the edge of a stall, how it could dive like a hawk and climb with relentless determination. They remembered trusting it in weather that terrified them, relying on its range to bring them home when fuel gauges dipped dangerously low. These stories circulated quietly, keeping the Mustang alive in memory even as official attention drifted elsewhere. The transition from war to peace also exposed the economic realities behind military aviation. Maintaining thousands of fighters was expensive, and governments faced pressure to cut spending. Scrapping aircraft seemed wasteful, but storage was hardly free. Some Mustangs were sold to private buyers for astonishingly low prices, sums that would later seem absurd given their historical value. Entrepreneurs, former pilots, and thrill-seekers saw opportunity where others saw excess. The Mustang, it turned out, still had plenty of life left outside military service. As 1945 faded into 1946 and beyond, the sky grew quieter. But the story of the P-51 was far from finished. It lingered in hangars and deserts, crossed oceans under new flags, and waited patiently for its next call to action. The world had changed, but the Mustang had always been a product of change, born from urgency and innovation. Peace simply forced it to adapt once more. Long after the last bombs fell, its engine still seemed ready to roar again, as if daring history to forget it. The Mustang's second life began quietly, almost unnoticed by a world obsessed with moving forward. As jets took center stage in military parades and glossy magazines, the P-51 slipped into new roles that were less glamorous but no less significant. Crates were opened, wings unfolded, and aircraft that had once worn American stars now received fresh paint and unfamiliar markings. One by one, they joined foreign air forces rebuilding from the ashes of war. To these nations, the Mustang was not outdated at all. It was modern, powerful, and battle-proven, a shortcut to air power in a tense and uncertain post-war world. In Europe, countries that had been occupied or devastated eagerly accepted the aircraft. For their pilots, flying a Mustang was like stepping directly into the elite ranks of wartime aces. Training manuals were translated, spare parts catalogs rewritten, and maintenance crews learned the quirks of the Merlin engine. The sound of that engine soon echoed again over airfields that only months earlier had been silent or ruined. The Mustang became a symbol of renewed sovereignty, proof that these nations could once again defend their skies. Across the Atlantic and Pacific, similar scenes played out. Latin American air forces adopted the P-51 as their premier fighter, patrolling borders, participating in exercises, and occasionally clashing with rivals. In Asia, Mustangs flew for countries navigating the dangerous early years of the Cold War, where old alliances shifted and new conflicts simmered just below the surface. The aircraft's long range and reliability made it ideal for regions with limited infrastructure where jets were impractical luxuries. In these skies, the Mustang was not a relic, but a frontline guardian. Yet even as it served abroad, the P-51 was finding unexpected purpose at home. Surplus aircraft sold to civilians began appearing at air races, their military paint stripped away and replaced with dazzling colors and sponsor logos. Engineers pushed engines beyond wartime limits, shaving weight, streamlining fuselages, and extracting speed that designers in the 1940s could scarcely imagine. The Mustang, once built to escort bombers, now tore around pylons at terrifying velocity, thrilling crowds and redefining what a propeller-driven aircraft could achieve. It became a celebrity again, not as a weapon but as a spectacle. This racing culture transformed the public image of the Mustang. It was no longer tied solely to memories of combat and loss. Instead, it represented daring, skill, and technological brilliance. Pilots became stars, their names announced over loudspeakers as engines screamed, and crowds leaned forward in anticipation. The aircraft's sleek lines, once optimized for survival, now existed purely for speed and beauty. The Mustang had reinvented itself, proving that its story was not confined to wartime chapters. Even so, history was not finished testing the aircraft. In 1950, war erupted on the Korean Peninsula, and the United States found itself scrambling to respond. Jet fighters were available, but they were few in number and plagued by early technical issues. Runways were limited, supply lines stretched thin, and ground troops urgently needed air support. In this chaotic environment, the Mustang was called back into uniform, renamed and repurposed. It returned to combat not as a high-altitude escort, but as a low-level attacker. Flying over Korea, the Mustang faced a far more dangerous mission profile than it ever had in Europe. It dove low to strafe enemy positions, attacking trucks, trains, and troop concentration. Anti-aircraft fire was relentless, and the aircraft's liquid-cooled engine made it vulnerable to ground fire. Pilots knew that a single well-placed bullet could be fatal, yet they flew anyway day after day, because their presence could mean the difference between life and death for soldiers below. The Mustang earned a new kind of respect, forged not in glamorous dogfights, but in grim, grinding support missions. Stories from Korea painted the P-51 as stubborn and dependable. It could loiter over the battlefield longer than jets, respond quickly to calls for help, and operate from rough, forward airstrips. Pilots spoke of returning with wings riddled with holes, engines coughing but still running, the aircraft carrying them home through sheer determination. It was not the future of air combat, but in those moments, It was exactly what the war demanded. As jets improved and took over the skies, the Mustang was gradually withdrawn once more. This time, however, its legacy was firmly cemented. It had fought in 2 wars, served dozens of nations, and proven adaptable far beyond its original purpose. Many air forces finally retired their Mustangs in the late 1950s and early 1960s, replacing them with newer designs. Some aircraft were scrapped, others sold yet again, beginning another cycle of civilian ownership and preservation. Collectors and aviation enthusiasts began to see the Mustang not just as a fast airplane, but as a living artifact. Restorations became labors of love, with painstaking attention paid to authenticity and detail. Original parts were hunted down, paint schemes researched, and engines rebuilt to factory specification. When these restored Mustangs flew, they carried with them layers of history, from escort missions over Germany to racing triumphs and battlefield heroics in Korea. The aircraft's growing presence at air shows turned it into a flying classroom. Veterans stood beneath its wings, sharing memories with younger generations who had only read about World War II in books. The sound of the Merlin engine became a time machine, instantly transporting listeners back to an era of total war and immense sacrifice. The Mustang bridged generations, connecting those who had lived history with those determined to remember it. In this way, the P-51 achieved something rare. It transcended its original purpose, became a symbol not just of American air power, but of adaptation itself. It had survived the brutal test of combat, the rapid march of technology, and the shifting priorities of a post-war world. Each new role added depth to its story, proving that relevance was not limited to novelty. By the time the Mustang finally stepped aside for good, its legend was secure. It was no longer merely an airplane that had won a war. It was a machine that refused to be defined by a single moment in time. Through foreign service, racing glory, and renewed combat, it had shown that even in an age obsessed with progress, there was room for endurance, reliability, and spirit. The Mustang's second act was not a footnote. It was a powerful reminder that history often continues long after we think the story is over. As the final military Mustangs were retired, the aircraft entered its longest and most reflective chapter, one defined not by urgency or survival, but by memory, preservation, and meaning. The P-51 no longer needed to prove itself in combat or competition. Its reputation was unshakable. What remained was the quieter task of carrying history forward in a world that was rapidly forgetting the realities of piston engines, propellers, and wars fought face to face in the sky. The Mustang became a messenger from another age, one that still had lessons to teach. Across abandoned airfields and private hangars, forgotten airframes were rediscovered. Some were little more than corroded shells, their aluminum skin eaten away by time and neglect. Others were remarkably intact, preserved by dry climates or sheer luck. Each one told a different story. Serial numbers hinted at factories, squadrons, and distant continents. Bullet holes, patched panels, and faded paint spoke silently of missions flown and dangers survived. To restorers, these aircraft were not projects. They were responsibility. The process of restoring a Mustang was slow, expensive, and often emotional. Engineers and historians worked side by side, debating the smallest details. Which radio belonged in this cockpit? Which squadron markings were correct for this serial number? Should scars of battle be erased or preserved as part of the aircraft's identity? Every decision balanced technical accuracy with historical respect. When a restored Mustang finally rolled out into the sunlight, it was not simply repaired, it was resurrected. Air shows became the Mustang's new stage. When it appeared, crowds instinctively fell silent before the engine even started. Then came the sound. The Merlin engine did not merely run, it announced itself, a deep, resonant thunder that vibrated through chests and memories alike. Older spectators closed their eyes, transported instantly to wartime airfields and distant skies. Younger ones stared in awe, sensing that this machine carried something heavier than fuel and oil. It carried time. The Mustang's continued presence in the air reshaped how history was experienced. Museums could display artifacts behind glass, but the P-51 moved, breathed, and lived. It showed what technology once demanded of its pilots: strength, intuition, courage. Watching it take off, tail lifting, wings biting into air, made history tangible. This was not a digital recreation or a faded photograph. This was real, loud, and alive. Popular culture embraced the Mustang as well. Films, documentaries, and books returned to its story again and again, drawn by its perfect blend of beauty and lethality. It became shorthand for World War II air combat itself. Even those with little interest in aviation recognized its silhouette. The long nose, the bubble canopy, the elegant wings were instantly identifiable. The Mustang was no longer just remembered by historians, it was remembered by society. Yet the aircraft's enduring appeal was not rooted solely in nostalgia. Engineers and pilots continued to admire its design. The P-51 represented a moment when aerodynamics, power, and purpose aligned perfectly. It was not over-engineered or excessive. It was precisely what it needed to be. In a modern world often defined by complexity, the Mustang stood as a reminder that elegance and effectiveness could coexist. Private owners took on the role once held by governments. They became caretakers of history, accepting the risks and costs that came with flying a 70-year-old Warbird. Every flight required meticulous preparation. Every landing carried weight. These pilots understood that they were not simply flying an airplane. They were flying a legacy entrusted to them by time itself. Tragically, accidents sometimes occurred. When a Mustang was lost, the aviation community mourned deeply. These were not replaceable machines. Each loss felt personal, as though a chapter of history had closed forever. Yet even in loss, the Mustang inspired respect. Investigations were thorough, lessons learned, and restorations elsewhere continued with renewed care. The goal was never immortality, it was stewardship. As decades passed, the number of airworthy Mustangs slowly declined, but their significance only grew. Veterans who had once flown them began to disappear, taking first-hand memories with them. In response, the Mustang became a bridge between generations. Grandchildren learned what their grandparents rarely spoke about by standing beneath those wings and asking questions. The aircraft gave voice to stories that words alone struggled to carry. In classrooms and ceremonies, the P-51 was used to explain not just how wars were fought, but why they mattered. It represented industrial effort, international cooperation, and human cost. It symbolized what happens when innovation is driven by necessity, and what remains when the necessity fades but the innovation endures. The Mustang did not glorify war, it contextualized it. In the modern era of stealth aircraft and unmanned drones, the Mustang's relevance might seem purely symbolic. Yet, symbolism matters. The P-51 reminds us that technology is always shaped by the people who build and use it. It reminds us that progress is not linear, and that greatness is sometimes born from constraint rather than abundance. It reminds us that the past is not dead metal, but living memory. When a Mustang flies today, it does something remarkable. It collapses time. For a few minutes, the distance between 1944 and the present disappears. The same air rushes over the same wings. The same engine rhythm pulses through the same structure. The difference is not the machine. It is us. We watch with knowledge of what came after, and that knowledge deepens the experience. The story of the P-51 Mustang after World War II is not a tale of decline. It is a story of transformation. From frontline fighter to global export, from racer to ground attacker, from museum piece to flying monument, it refused to settle into a single identity. Each phase added weight to its legend, rather than diminishing it. And so the Mustang endures, not because it must, but because we choose to keep it alive. Every restoration, every flight, every child who looks up in wonder is part of that choice. Long after the last combat mission and the final official retirement, the P-51 continues to fly its most important mission of all, remembering when its shadow passes over the ground. It carries more than history. It carries proof that some machines are more than machines, and some stories never truly end.